My stepson didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just stood in the doorway, looked at me like I was a piece of old furniture, and said quietly, "You should start looking for somewhere else to stay." That was the moment I understood something no one warned you about when you get old. You don't lose your strength first. You lose your place. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I buried my wife of 22 years. Margaret wasn't just my wife. She was the last person in this world who spoke my name with warmth, the last person who looked at me like I still mattered, the last person who made this house feel like a home instead of walls and furniture. And the day after her funeral, I became a guest in it. Her son, Daniel, moved into the master bedroom the same night relatives left. I didn't say anything. Grief makes you quiet, makes you overlook things you normally wouldn't. I told myself he was hurting. I told myself he needed comfort. I told myself we were family. But family don't start replacing you while the flowers from the funeral are still fresh. By the third day, my chair in the living room had been moved. By the fifth day, my clothes had been shifted from the master closet into the guest room. By the seventh day, Daniel stopped asking me what I wanted for dinner. By the 10th day, he stopped talking to me at all unless he needed something. And on the 14th day, he stood in the doorway and told me I should find somewhere else to stay. I remember looking at him, waiting for the joke, waiting for the grief talking, waiting for the moment he'd realize what he just said. It never came. "This house was Mom's," he continued calmly. "She would want me to take care of it now." I swallowed. "I've lived here for 22 years, I said quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just said something that made my stomach drop. "You were her husband, not my father." I had known Daniel since he was 19. I helped pay his college tuition when Margaret couldn't. I helped fix his first car. I sat in the front row when he got married. I held his children when they were born. And in one sentence, I became nobody. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the guest bed staring at the hallway where Margaret used to walk toward me every morning with coffee in her hand. I kept hearing her voice in my head. "This will always be your home too, Walt." I believed her. God help me, I believed her. The next morning, Daniel's wife, Karen, came into the kitchen while I was making toast. She didn't look at me. She opened the fridge, sighed loudly, and said, "We need to start organizing things. This house is too small for 3 adults." Too small? It was a 4-bedroom home on 2 acres of land in Pennsylvania, but suddenly there wasn't room for me. I stopped eating. I stopped watching TV. I started spending most of my time in the garage, sitting on an old stool beside the toolbox Margaret bought me years ago for Christmas. I could feel it happening, the slow, quiet erasing, not with anger, not with fights, with politeness, with inconvenience, with the kind of behavior that makes you feel guilty for existing. Daniel began having phone calls in the other room, whispered ones, about paperwork, documents, and next steps. Every time I entered the room, the call stopped. One afternoon, I came back from a short walk and found a stack of my old photo albums sitting in a cardboard box near the garage door. No explanation, no conversation, just relocation, like I was being packed before I even knew I was leaving. That was the moment fear crept in. Not loud fear, quiet fear, the kind that sits in your chest and whispers, "You are not safe here anymore." That evening, Daniel finally said the words out loud. "We've been looking into assisted living options," he said casually while scrolling on his phone. "It might be better for you. You'll have people your age around." I stared at him. "I don't need assisted living." He didn't look up. "You don't get to decide that alone anymore." And that was when I realized something terrifying. This wasn't grief. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was a plan. And I was already behind in it, because while I was mourning my wife, they were preparing my exit. I went to bed that night with a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a child. I felt like I didn't belong in the place I slept. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the thought that kept repeating in my head. Margaret trusted him, and I had no idea what he was doing with that trust now that she was gone.
I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the folder. It was sitting on the kitchen table where Margaret used to place fresh flowers every Sunday morning. A thick manila folder with a rubber band around it. Neat, organized, intentional. Daniel wasn't home. Karen wasn't home. But the folder was. And something inside me told me it wasn't meant for me to see. I stood there for a long time, staring at it like it might move on its own, like it might explain itself if I waited. Then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I trusted my instincts. I sat down and pulled the rubber band off. The first paper I saw had my name on it, Walter Hayes. Underneath it, in bold letters, Power of Attorney, Temporary Guardianship Request. My hands went cold. I kept reading. The document claimed I was showing signs of cognitive decline, that I had been forgetful, confused, and unable to manage daily responsibilities, that Daniel, as my closest living family contact, was requesting legal authority to manage my finances, property decisions, and healthcare choices. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. Cognitive decline? I had changed the oil in the truck last week. I had fixed the back fence after a storm. I had balanced the checkbook the same way I had for 20 years. But on paper, I was already losing my mind. I flipped the page. There were notes. Typed notes. Dates. Examples. Walter forgot where he placed his keys. Walter left the stove on. Walter appears disoriented in conversations. Lies. Clean, believable lies. The kind that look real if you don't know the person they're written about. I kept turning pages. Then I saw the line that made my stomach drop. Recommendation. Placement in assisted living facility for his safety and well-being. This wasn't a suggestion. This was documentation. Preparation. This had been in motion for days, maybe weeks. While I was crying in the garage over Margaret's old gardening gloves, they were building a legal case to remove me from my own life. I heard the front door open. I quickly slid the papers back into the folder and wrapped the band around it just as Daniel walked into the kitchen. He froze when he saw me sitting there. His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to me. For a brief second, he looked nervous. "What's that?" I asked calmly. "Just paperwork," he said too quickly. "For what?" He sighed like I was being difficult. "For your benefit, Walt." My benefit. That word burned. "I read some of it," I said. His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't go through things that aren't yours." I stared at him. "Papers about my mind, my money, and my life aren't mine?" Karen walked in behind him, sensing the tension. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just said something that chilled me. "We're trying to make this easy for you." Easy. Like removing me was an act of kindness. "I'm not confused," I said. He gave me a look I will never forget. Not anger, not frustration, certainty. That's what they all say. They all. Like I had already been grouped with strangers losing themselves in nursing homes. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about helping me. This was about proving I couldn't help myself. And the more I protested, the more I would fit the story they were writing. So I stopped talking. I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said quietly. And for the first time since Margaret died, Daniel smiled, because he thought I was giving in. That night, I didn't sit in the garage. I sat in the guest room with the door closed and thought. 22 years in this house, I knew where every document Margaret kept was. I knew where the old safe was hidden behind the closet panel. I knew where she kept copies of everything important. And for the first time since the funeral, I had a reason to look. After midnight, when the house was silent, I got up. I moved slowly down the hallway, like a man walking through someone else's home. I entered the master bedroom quietly. Daniel and Karen were asleep. I could hear them breathing. I went to the closet, reached behind the back panel, and slid the small metal box out. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were passports, insurance papers, bank documents, and Margaret's will. I sat on the floor and opened it. My eyes scanned quickly, and then I saw the line that changed everything. The house wasn't left to Daniel. It wasn't left to me either. It was placed in a living trust, a trust that required both of us to agree on any sale or transfer. My heart started pounding. Daniel couldn't sell the house. He couldn't remove me. He couldn't touch anything unless I signed. That's why he needed me declared incompetent. That's why he was building a case. That's why he wanted power of attorney, because without it, he had nothing. I sat there in the dark, holding Margaret's will, and for the first time since she died, I didn't feel helpless. I felt something else, aware, because now I understood the game, and Daniel made one critical mistake. He thought I didn't know the rules.
The next morning, I made coffee like nothing had happened. Same mug, same chair, same slow sip while staring out the kitchen window at Margaret's rose bushes. Daniel watched me carefully, not like a son watching a grieving stepfather, like a man watching a clock tick, waiting, measuring, looking for signs, confusion, forgetfulness, weakness. I gave him none. I asked what day it was, not because I didn't know, because I wanted him to think I didn't. Thursday, he said. I nodded slowly, pretending to process it. Then I asked what time his shift started. A small thing, but I saw it in his face. Relief. He thought the story in those papers was coming true. Good. Let him believe it. Because while Daniel was building a case to prove I was losing my mind, I was building a case to prove I wasn't. After he left for work, I did something I hadn't done in years. I put on Margaret's old cardigan, took my truck keys, and drove to the bank. Not our regular branch, a different one across town. Somewhere no one knew me as Walter and Margaret. Somewhere I was just a man with documents and questions. I asked to speak to a manager. A young woman named Elise invited me into her office. Polite, professional, curious. "How can I help you today, Mr. Hayes?" I placed Margaret's trust papers on her desk. "I need to understand exactly who can touch what," I said calmly. She read through everything carefully. Then she looked up at me. "Sir, no one can do anything with this property or these accounts without your written consent." I nodded. "And if someone tried?" Her expression shifted. "That would be considered fraud." I swallowed slowly. Good to know. I didn't tell her about Daniel. I didn't accuse. I didn't complain. I simply asked her to print copies of every document tied to the trust, the accounts, and the property. Paper trails, proof of clarity, proof of competence. Before I left, I asked her one more question. If someone were trying to prove I wasn't mentally fit, what would help show that I am? She didn't hesitate. Medical evaluation, legal consultation, and documented financial activity you handle yourself. I thanked her, and for the first time in weeks, I had a plan. That afternoon, I visited my doctor, not because I was sick, because I needed records. I told him everything, about the papers, the power of attorney request, the assisted living recommendation. He listened without interrupting. Then he ran tests, memory questions, cognitive checks, simple tasks. At the end, he leaned back in his chair and smiled gently. "Walter, you're sharper than most men 20 years younger than you." I asked him to put that in writing. He did. That night, Daniel came home with takeout, Chinese food, my favorite. He placed it on the table like a peace offering. "How are you feeling today?" he asked casually. I looked at him with soft eyes. "Tired," I said. He nodded sympathetically. "Don't worry, we're taking care of things." I almost admired how smoothly he lied. Karen smiled at me from across the table.
the kind of smile people give to someone they think is fragile. I ate slowly, quietly, gratefully, because they thought they were feeding a man who didn't understand what was happening, but I understood everything. Later that night, I heard them talking in their bedroom. They thought I was asleep. "She's filing the paperwork Monday," Karen whispered. "Good, before he changes his mind," replied Daniel. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. They weren't waiting anymore. They were accelerating, which meant I had to move faster. The next morning, I called a lawyer, an old one, a man Margaret and I had used years ago when setting up the trust. His name was Harold Benton. His voice sounded surprised when he heard mine. "Walter?" I thought. "So did they," I said quietly. I met him that afternoon. I showed him the copy of the power of attorney request Daniel had prepared. Harold read it slowly. His jaw tightened. "This is premeditated," he said. I nodded. "They're trying to legally erase me from my own life." He looked me in the eye. "Not if we move first." And that's when I learned something important. Daniel made two mistakes. He assumed I didn't know the rules, and he assumed I didn't have help. By the time I got home, Harold had already drafted a document Daniel would never expect. A formal notice stating that any attempt to file guardianship, power of attorney, or property action without my consent would be met with immediate legal action for fraud and elder exploitation. All I had to do was wait for Daniel to make his move, because now I wasn't reacting. I was ready. And for the first time since Margaret died, I was the man holding the door.
Monday morning came with a strange calm. Daniel left the house early, dressed nicer than usual, pressed shirt, polished shoes, nervous energy hidden behind fake confidence. I watched from the kitchen window as he backed out of the driveway, checking his reflection in the mirror like a man going to an important meeting. Because he was, just not the one he thought. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Harold. "They're here," he said quietly. "Right on schedule." Daniel and Karen had arrived at the county clerk's office with their paperwork: guardianship petition, medical incompetency claim, power of attorney request, a clean, organized folder meant to make me disappear politely. What Daniel didn't know was that Harold had already sent a legal notice to the clerk's office at 8:03 a.m., stamped, signed, filed. A warning attached to my name. Any filing submitted today regarding Walter Hayes must be flagged for potential elder exploitation and legal review, which meant instead of processing Daniel's paperwork, they escorted him into a side office and asked questions, lots of them. "Does Mr. Hayes know you're filing this? Where is the medical evaluation proving incompetence? Why is there a legal notice attached to his name this morning?" Harold stayed on the phone with me while it happened. I could hear muffled voices in the background, confusion, pressure, Daniel trying to explain something he hadn't prepared to explain because he thought I was at home, confused, unaware, not listening to every word through my lawyer's phone. Then Harold said something that made my chest feel lighter than it had in weeks. "They're asking why he's in such a hurry." I closed my eyes. Finally, someone else was asking the right question. Daniel left that office without filing a single paper, but he didn't come home right away. He went somewhere else first, the realtor. Harold told me that too, because once suspicion starts, it spreads. The clerk had quietly called the realtor's office listed on Daniel's paperwork, just a routine verification, which turned into another conversation Daniel wasn't prepared for. By the time he walked through the front door that afternoon, he looked different. Not angry, not loud, shaken. Karen followed behind him, pale and silent. I was sitting in the living room reading Margaret's old gardening magazine. Same chair, same calm. I looked up slowly. "Good day?" I asked. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, not as an old man, not as a problem, but as someone who had moved pieces on the board he didn't know existed. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "Did you go somewhere today?" I tilted my head. "Just the bank, doctor, lawyer." I watched the color drain from his face in real time. Karen stepped back like she suddenly didn't want to be standing next to him. "You went to a lawyer?" he asked. I nodded gently. "Of course. You said I might not be thinking clearly. I thought I should double-check." He didn't speak after that, because there was nothing safe left to say. That night, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. Daniel didn't turn on the TV. Karen didn't cook. They stayed in their room whispering for hours, not planning anymore, worrying. And for the first time since Margaret died, I slept peacefully, because the fear had changed sides. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. Not a neighbor, not a delivery, a sheriff's deputy. Daniel opened it. I could hear the conversation from the hallway. "Mr. Daniel Brooks?" "Yes." "This is a notice regarding potential elder exploitation. This is not an arrest. This is a notice." Silence. Paper rustling. "You are advised to cease any legal, financial, or property actions concerning Mr. Walter Hayes immediately." I stepped into the hallway just in time to see Daniel holding the paper with shaking hands. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no confidence left in his eyes, only realization. He hadn't been outsmarting an old man. He had been underestimating one. The deputy nodded politely to me before leaving. "Morning, sir." "Morning," I replied calmly. Daniel whispered, "You did this." I shook my head softly. "No, Daniel, you did." And then I said the words he never thought he would hear. "You should start looking for another place to live." Because now, I wasn't the one being pushed out.
Daniel didn't argue. That's how I knew it was over. Not with shouting, not with threats, but with silence. The kind of silence a person makes when they realize the ground beneath them is no longer solid. He and Karen packed that night. No drama, no apologies, no explanations. Just drawers opening and closing, footsteps moving back and forth across the hallway Margaret once decorated with family photos. I sat in my chair and listened, not with anger, not with sadness, but with something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. By morning, their car was gone. The driveway was empty again, and for the first time since my wife died, the house felt like mine. I walked slowly from room to room, touching walls, straightening picture frames, opening windows to let fresh air push out the heaviness they had left behind. In the kitchen, I made coffee the way Margaret liked it, too strong, too hot. I stood at the sink and looked at the garden she loved. The roses were overgrown, the lawn uneven, but still alive, just like me. At 10 a.m., Harold arrived with final documents. We sat at the dining table where Margaret used to host Thanksgiving dinners. He placed the papers neatly in front of me. "Eviction notice is filed," he said. "Protective order is active. Your estate is now legally sealed from any outside claim." I signed where he pointed, steady hand, clear mind. When he finished, he looked at me for a long moment. "You know," he said softly, "most people your age would have been too afraid to fight this." I smiled faintly. I wasn't fighting for the house. I was fighting for my dignity. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret passed. I went into the garage, found my old toolbox, and started fixing the garden fence Daniel said was not worth repairing. Each nail I hammered felt like reclaiming something invisible, not wood, not wire, but myself. Mrs. Carter from next door walked by and waved. "Good to see you out here, Walter." "Good to be seen," I replied, and I meant it, because that's what this was really about. Not being erased, not being quietly removed from your own life because you are old and alone. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down. Same chair, same view, but a different man. I realized something important.
Daniel didn't try to take my house because he hated me. He tried to take it because he thought I was already gone, invisible, finished, easily replaced. And maybe that's what happens to many people our age. The world starts speaking around you instead of to you, making decisions for you instead of with you, treating you like a memory before you've even left. But here I was, still here, still thinking, still deciding, still living. I took a slow breath and looked at the front door Margaret loved so much, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. And that was enough. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Walter's remind us that growing older does not mean becoming invisible. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful story.